Welcome to the Contrarian Capitalist podcast. I'm delighted to be joined today by returning guest Frank Wright. Frank, how are you today?
Oh, I'm very well, thank you. Thank you for having me back.
Really looking forward to this, and this conversation can go in any way, shape, or form. I guess the open-ended question that I'm going to start with is, what on earth has been going on in the UK in the last few months? Because it all seems to be unraveling, and I can say that being about 8,000 kilometers away. Uh, what do you make of what's going on at the moment, socially, politically, etc.?
Well, we live amidst the unraveling, as you put it, of a wholly discredited system. For decades now, participation in elections has been falling. The last one, which was run by Keir Starmer, I think it was just under 50% of the eligible voters actually voted. There's a study by the Independent Public Policy Research Group, the IPPR, that says half of us, and it shows that half the people who could vote didn't. So Keir Starmer got a majority, a rather large one, on the basis of winning a fraction of half of the available vote. This is the lowest turnout either on record or for over 100 years, depending on who you believe. So the option of none of the above is the option that's being chosen by the British people. And I think that's not just a British problem. I think that that's an exceptionally British problem because change is heavily resisted by the British liberal consensus. But the liberal consensus generally, and by that I mean the kind of governments you're allowed to pick and no other in the West, is heavily policed. This means that people who say things that aren't liberal or that are critical of liberal policies are excluded from the political process, are demonized or censored, in some cases criminalized. And as in France and Germany and Austria, liberals cooperate to set up what they call a firewall, in German a Brandmauer, or a cordon sanitaire in French, which basically means that if non-liberals win elections, they're not allowed to enter the government. Recently in Romania, the presidential
Hmm.
election was basically cancelled because an anti-war national populist looked certain to win it. This can't be allowed. The reason why this is happening is because liberal policies have created the chaos in which people live. Liberal policies have for decades, many decades, at least since the end of the Soviet Union, made utopian promises, but in fact delivered a hell on earth. It is them that is the problem. It is their politics which is the problem, and there is no solution within that liberal system to any of these problems. And so their only solution is to call you names and shut you down and refuse to let you into politics, which is neither liberal nor democratic. So we can see that accelerating in Britain. There are obvious hate crimes that have been expanded to include liberal critical speech generally. But basically, if you complain about the mess they've made of your life and of your nation and so on, then you will be criminalized and potentially even locked up. But you'll certainly be punished in some way. As a remarkable instance of this, many people have turned towards the Reform Party of Nigel Farage, which has been promoted in the newspapers as having led in the polls with 26% over Labour's 25%, become the first party of Britain. It also claims vast numbers of people have joined it, saying there's about 220,000 people in it, making it a party of mass membership. Now, the problem with these figures is that they don't include the recent spate of resignations, which have followed the demonisation of perhaps the only effective politician in Parliament at the moment, Rupert Lowe. Now, Rupert Lowe MP is a Reform MP. He's one of five. The Reform only have five MPs due to the peculiarities of the British system. Millions of votes don't translate into millions of seats. I think the Liberal Democrats got dozens of seats on a smaller amount of the vote. Anyway, Rupert Lowe has called for remigration, which means the mass deportation of people who have no right to be here. Recently, Nigel Farage has described this policy as unpopular and unworkable, but a GB News survey showed that 66% of Britons that they asked were in favour of remigration, and 85% of them were in favour of immediately deporting all illegal migrants, all people in these hotels that we're spending millions on, and everyone who's committed crimes and has no right to be here. So it is an enormously popular policy, and it is one which 99% of Reform voters themselves support. But Nigel Farage has recently described people who call for this as racist because his party has effectively been bought by a homosexual Sri Lankan Muslim called Zia Yusuf, who donated £200,000 to Mr. Farage a few months ago and has now become the chairman of Reform, with Reform members and Reform officers and Reform regional organisers all claiming that he now effectively owns the party and directs the policy. And Farage himself has admitted that the allegations against Rupert Lowe originated with Zia Yusuf and not with himself, although Farage has consistently supported these allegations. They've been found to be untrue by a King's Counsel, a judge who was appointed to investigate them. Rupert Lowe has been exonerated, but nonetheless, they continue to smear him, calling him demented and so on, questioning his mental capacity. It's disgraceful. Why is this happening? The British system is closely policed to maintain the boundaries of its political options. So you can vote for left liberals, right liberals, green liberals, or extreme liberals, but you can't vote for anyone else. You can't vote for anyone who's actually going to fix the problems that the liberals have created. And another popular commentator, Matt Goodwin, has recently come out saying that remigration or mass deportation is an extremist policy and shouldn't be supported. It's unpopular. He's just basically telling lies. Matt Goodwin is a senior fellow of Chatham House. What is Chatham House? Chatham House was set up in the early 1920s as the British arm of the Council on Foreign Relations. These two organisations are basically the management group of international liberal democracy. They are concerned with setting the political paradigm with the manufacture of public belief, and basically with rigging your system through propaganda by telling you what is and is not allowed. They've repeatedly published things to this effect, telling you that basically their job is to lead public opinion and never to follow public opinion. So that's what Matt Goodwin's doing, and many people see him as a true friend of anyone seeking an escape from the liberal trap, but he isn't. He works for the management as well. What's happening now, in short, is that the true mechanism of liberal democracy in Europe and in Britain is being revealed. It has for 100 years been the rule of an elite through the production, mass manufacture of belief, through the mass media, through all forms of cultural production. This means basically that all your entertainment, your news, your thought leaders, your education, your messaging, your adverts, all of it, everything that you've received through the mass media, modern art, music, and so on, film and television, these have all been sponsored to some degree by the sponsors of liberal democracy to propagandize you into believing that you are free and that this is the best and final system, and that anyone who disagrees with it is a dangerous lunatic or an extremist and should be ignored. This is the reason why so much of your consumer culture is woke. It's why your work is humorless and why you are ruled by corrupt and humorless commissars everywhere. Because liberal democracy is a managed democracy and is not free at all. It was never intended to be. And as it unwinds now, this is being revealed to people, and they find it very hard to accept that everything they've been told for the last 100 years must be seen with an extreme degree of skepticism, because most of it's basically just propaganda. That's your history, that's your beliefs about the world and how just your government is, because people are beginning to realize that in reality, their institutions don't function correctly anymore. The police don't catch criminals, the schools don't educate you, the NHS doesn't make you better, doesn't really effectively treat you. None of these things work as they're intended, and the government is basically the enemy of the nation, which is its people and not the state. The state is the enemy of the people today, and it is the national tribe, the people who originate from here, who are the nation. Now, this is an important point, and not just a racist one, if you want to make that Trotskyite tribe, because the state actually has duties. Now, I think it's remarkable that after people have such a long education these days, but practically no one knows that all states, whether they're dictatorships or democracies, have duties to their people. And if they don't discharge those duties, they have no right to rule. They're not legitimate. Those duties are briefly to provide security for the nation, to provide some promise of some prosperity for the nation, and also to supply meaning. Now, our state has been derelict in its duties for many years. It doesn't do any of these things. It has no right to rule. This means you don't have to obey it. This means that it no longer has any right to tell you what is legal and what is not. And on that matter, the enormous mass migration crisis in the United Kingdom is the result of governments since 1997 ignoring their own promises to limit or reverse mass migration. So for almost 30 years, every government has been elected on a promise to reverse or halt mass migration. And it's done the opposite, especially since Boris Johnson started what was called the Boris Wave, which since his tenure has seen 1.3 million plus people come from largely from India and Africa, unskilled people, which is an enormous number on indefinite leave to remain visas. And the quote from Dominic Cummings, who was his right-hand man at the time, is that he said to Johnson that if he did this, it would open the floodgates to unskilled mass third world immigration into Britain, the biggest wave of immigration we've ever seen, and it has been. And Johnson said, open the floodgates, I don't care, I want the Financial Times to like me. Why would the Financial Times like a British Prime Minister who floods the country with unskilled third world migrants? Well, the answer is simple. It's because unskilled third world immigration does two things. It supplies an enormous number of immediately hungry consumers, which make the GDP line go up. And what it also does is it depresses wages and conditions. It doesn't just drive your wages down, it drives the conditions of your labour down as well, meaning that you can now ask for fewer benefits, shorter holidays, and so on. You know, less perks, fewer perks, no perks, in fact, because the pressure on you is enormous, and the selection for competing employees so much greater for your boss. So they can simply employ people who are cheaper and make fewer demands. So your standard of living is driven down by mass migration, not just in increased demand for housing, not just in the wholesale destruction of the social fabric and the replacement of a high trust with a no trust society. Basically, what's happened to Britain is what's happened to the West generally when it's followed this international consumer globalism, is that our nations have been replaced by a borderless supermarket browsed by bargain hunters, mutually hostile strangers, where everything's a transaction about what I can get for myself, and no one really has any ties to anything more.
It's quite a sombering and sobering thought, as we mentioned, or you mentioned the first time you were on a few months ago, that all of this, all these policies, I think you mentioned, if I'm correct, that that started with the Blair government in the 90s, and it's basically exacerbated from there. It's interesting now having this perspective, as I said earlier on at the start, now being 8,000 kilometers away. The first time we were talking, we were in the same country. I'm now not in the same country, but I keep up to date as best as I can. And again, via the propaganda machine that's the BBC and other sources. And it seems to me that the level of hatred, probably, I'm going to go along and say frustration at the moment, but you might say it's hatred. I'll leave that with you. It just seems to be getting worse and worse and worse. And yet, in my mind, when people, or the dots that should be put together, people aren't putting those dots together, because then you're just labeled as, a bigot, a racist, whatever it is. And I'm not sure what the way out of that is, to be honest with you.
Well, I think that reality makes the best arguments, and that there's a curious position that we're in right now, is that the propaganda system, if you like, the international system throughout the West, which has been used to govern us all and to manufacture belief in the system for 100 years, has never been more powerful or effective than it is now. But at the same time, the real life effects of the system that propaganda promotes are unignorably bad. And it is reality that is persuading people. People aren't radicalized by people like me or lunatics, other lunatics online. Although that being online generally sends you mad, whether you agree with me or not. It's not just your political enemies that go insane from being over Twittered. It's everybody. But aside from that, it is reality that's radicalizing people, if you want to call it that. And what radicalization is, what extremism is simply a rejection of liberal policies. The people who are rejecting these policies haven't suddenly woken up and decided that they're extremists. They've woken up and they've realized that they can't pay their bills, despite the fact that they have two jobs. They can't afford to live a decent life. Some of them can't afford to buy a house or even have children. And they're beginning to question what the point is of living in a supposedly rich country when they get nothing and nothing works. And everything seems to be broken and getting worse. And there's no real plan to fix anything. And for successive decades, we've had extravagant promises from governments of both sides of the liberal spectrum, none of whom have done anything realistic to reverse what you might call the depression of wages, the wholesale destruction of our national culture and identity, and so on. And that's because it's intentional. Now, this is the big problem: is that you are fighting against the fallacy that people believe the government actually is just and basically wants to do the best for you. It doesn't. This is the end of the global system. We are living in the end times of the global system. And the global system was basically about one thing. It was about making everything into a global monoculture. That means the same economic system, which is basically consumerism, not industrial production, consuming things, buying things. That means advertising and an aspirational lifestyle. Everything becomes a commodity. That means a sort of addiction economy, where your life essentially has no higher spiritual purpose than shopping. And that's what we have now. It's effectively meaningless. It's leading to a great epidemic of despair, as is evidenced by the use of antidepressants and illegal drugs as well. But aside from that, the problem that you face here is that the liberal system is dying. And that's because it has delivered a chaos on earth instead of the paradise promised in its advertisements. This isn't a problem that you can correct by becoming more authoritarian or prohibiting people from expressing their views or their complaints or locking them out of politics. What's going to happen, and what is happening, is that the liberal governments in Britain, France, Germany, and elsewhere, they're just becoming more repressive, and they're becoming openly repressive of anyone who criticizes them, as it becomes clear that none of these people are going to do anything to fix any of the serious problems. And so calling people extremists for complaining about their lives being ruined by design is quite the predicament. Now, by design seems to sound like a conspiracy theory, but it's not a conspiracy theory. The liberal system was designed in the early 1920s through apparatus such as the Council on Foreign Relations, but other groups as well, to basically coordinate and internationally manage the emerging liberal democratic system that was intended to replace the post-First World War civilizational order. There would be no more of an imperial Europe, no more Austria-Hungary, no more German Empire, and so on. There'd be liberal democracies instead. And of course, the one in the Weimar Republic was a great and soaring success and is remembered with extreme sentimental fondness to this day. And justifiably so, if you ask me. However, you have a situation now where people are beginning to realize that there's something profoundly wrong with the policies of our state. Why are we being told that it is a moral virtue to deindustrialize everything? Why can't we burn real energy? Instead, we have to use fake energy. Why are our supermarkets full of fake food and not real food? Why do so many of our medicines make people chronically ill? Why are so many people chronically ill? Where is all this going? Why are we seeing so many millions of people invited from a limitless supply of people overseas that effectively abolishes our homeland? I mean, if these people don't go home, we will not have one. My children won't have a home. They'll never know what it is to have one. It is not a racist position. It's a simple fact. The simple fact is that these nations, our nations, the European nations, the British ones, home nations, they were all founded by the tribes who originate here. And if you eliminate them by overwhelming them with millions of foreigners, they cease to be what they were. That's just a fact. It's not a condition of prejudice. And people like me, who are nationalists, don't actually hate other people. I just think everyone has a right to a home, and dare I say it, including me. Why is that such an extreme position? Well, because you've been told for decades, all your life, that to say these things is hateful. Whereas in fact, you are only allowed to belong to one tribe, and that's the liberal tribe. If you are British or English or Irish or Welsh, and not simply passported or imported into these islands, if you're from them. That's the only tribe you're allowed to belong to. Now, this is insane and irrational, because the entire history of the human race is the history of tribes and their interests. Every tribe naturally seeks its own advantage. Every tribe wishes to preserve itself, loves its own customs, probably thinks itself better than the others, probably has other tribal friends and enemies, probably seeks its advantage to the disprivilege of other tribes. This is normal. It wants to celebrate its customs. It wants to protect its homelands. All tribes do this. And yet our tribes are the only ones who've been told that it is evil for us to do this. whilst we celebrate the privileges of all the other ones. I think that this is such an obvious nonsense that it can't be sustained. And life has always been like this until the liberals told us that it was wicked to act normally. So you are also seeing within this political crisis of legitimacy, where the liberal system is being held to account for the disaster that it's created. People are realizing that it can't escape it, that the liberal system has no solutions, that it has to go, that it is the problem. Alongside this, you have that strange corruption of meaning, where people are beginning to realize as well, we've been told things that are the opposite of common sense. We've been told that to notice the obvious is some sort of crime, and that to go against nature is a kind of moral duty. Now, you could call this normophobia. So you could call this the irrational hatred of anything normal and of norms themselves. So you might be also aware that norms are simply what people are told is normal. And these norms have changed radically in my own lifetime, from things that were largely accepted as normal for a very long time, centuries. Suddenly all those norms are morally inverted or corrupted, or they become different norms. And there are strong senses of prohibition or censure attached to formerly normal opinions. And these opinions aren't hateful. They're not irrational hatreds. They're just normal impulses. I would like to have a family. I'd like to afford somewhere to live. I would like my children to be safe in the playground and so on. I'd like to have a home. These things aren't insane. Nobody sanely detaches their front door and thinks it's normal if anyone wanders in and helps themselves to everything. But that's what we've done to our nation. That's what's been done to our homeland by our supposed guardians of our state. They've taken the door off the hinges, and the place is being ransacked. And of course, once it fills up to a certain point, there's chaos. Now, this is not going to produce harmony. It never has. And you can only conclude that although a lot of these people do seem to be bumbling mediocrities, that some of them seem to be motivated by a sort of civilizational vengeance. When you look into the liberal project, you see that a lot of these true believers, they really do believe, and they did believe after the First World War, that the only way to halt a repetition of that industrial scale massacre was to create a global system, to abolish war, and to create a League of Nations that became the United Nations and so on, and all the international institutions to do it in order that there was a sort of world government. That's not a conspiracy theory. There's acres of books published on this, and it went on for decades, right up until very recently. And the use of NATO, for example, by George Soros wrote a paper on this, saying that NATO should be used to not just to colonize new lands through military force to open up their markets, but also to police domestic populations in the West now that the Cold War had ended. These are remarkable documents, and if people were aware of them, they'd be more aware of what these functions, the functions that these things actually perform. NATO isn't a defensive alliance; it's more there to police you, and there to ensure the spread or the export of the liberal system until it becomes global. So you are seeing liberal globalism dissolve now. I should say this. It's like, this is disastrous. It can't fix itself, but it is dissolving. And the main reason it's dissolving is because the United States no longer sponsors it.
That brings me on to one of your recent articles, and that is the abolition of the 20th century. And we can go down the path of talking about the USA. We can talk about Ukraine, Russia, and sort of touch upon there because there's some overlapping themes. But one of the paragraphs that you wrote, and I was going to read it out quote for quote, is we are living in the end game of the old order. The liberal bubble has burst, and the alibis of its remaining leaders are powerless to explain away the crime scene they have made of our world. If you can, because I know that correlates with pretty much everything you've just said. Can you just put a bit more meat on the bones there? Why is this the end game? Have they reached too far? Have they realised that more people are against them? What's the overarching theme there, Frank?
Oh, I don't think it's got anything to do with belief or people want or anything like that. It's basically the hard limits of reality. If you think about it, it was a utopian project. That's to say, you're trying to create something that doesn't exist. And you're trying to realize that through colonizing the world, through cultural propaganda, subversion, regime change wars, and so on, and the manufacture of mass belief in the system. Now, it's come up against hard limits. This project really accelerated at several major points in the last century. And one of them was the fall of the Soviet Union, where people like Charles Krauthammer were self-intoxicated with the idea of this unipolar moment, where the United States suddenly found itself as the world's only hyperpower. How did it use that moment? Thomas Hirschfeld's paper for Rand gave 4 options for the United States at this critical juncture in history. And one of them, number 1, was only global power. The other 3 would have seen the US withdraw from its enormous overseas military commitments and render a peace dividend to its own people. That's to say, it would cut the military budget, withdraw from its global empire, and spend the money at home instead. And for a while, we heard a lot about the peace dividend, but it never materialized because the United States chose the option of becoming the world's only power and to extend its power globally. And so, in fact, it increased its spending, it increased its regime change activities, which was a business really started under Reagan to subvert Warsaw Pact satellite nations and absorb them into the Western system. But that started to be used against countries abroad, as well as at home. You will notice that regime change has taken place in our own countries. And it is a form of directed and intentional subversion towards the end of a global empire. If you just think of it as like pasteurizing national cultures into a chickenability, a universal product in which anyone can feel at home because we're all homeless, because we're all global citizens now. And that phrase became very popular. So the reason why it's ended, basically, this was extremely expensive. The United States is in trillions of dollars of debt. I think around $9.5 trillion of those are directly attributable to the regime change wars from September 2001 to present. They've been enormously expensive. The United States would go bankrupt if it did not withdraw from its global ambitions. So there's a compelling financial reason for the US to retreat, and it is a retreat. It has abandoned the idea of securing a global empire through power and propaganda. That's why it now describes USAID's operations, for example, as corruption. Overnight, your attempt to project global cultural power, to sponsor culture in a global social revolution, which is what it was, that was once your national security strategy, your grand strategy, and now overnight it becomes corruption because you've abandoned it, because the US is no longer interested in it, because it will go bust if it doesn't stop. Why did it fail? The 1990s saw the United States pursue a model that was basically modeled elsewhere in the West as well, of exporting its industry to places like China. And it sold its industries to China very cheap in order to buy back manufactured goods at cut price rates. And this was called an economic miracle by Bill Clinton. Now, at the same time, Bill Clinton promised everyone that as the Chinese took Western industry and started to supply the West with these cheap consumer goods, it would liberalize. That as China got richer, it would magically become more liberal and therefore would become absorbed into the liberal global system. Well, it did get richer and it did become the world's leading industrial power, but it didn't liberalize and it never will. And that's because that was a fantasy. And there are lots of fantasies that are unraveling now. And when men go mad and believe their dreams can be made real by the force of will, usually tragedy is the outcome. And this is a tragedy on a grand scale. It's resulted in the deaths of millions of people. It's destroyed entire nations, our own included. And the cause of restoration is an obvious one, but I believe it has begun. And I think it is inevitable for those reasons. These are not really political reasons. They're not about arguments or preference. They're just about reality. It's like getting into the water and complaining of being wet. There isn't the money there anymore. The world is no longer a unipolar playground, the United States. Reality has contradicted these utopian expeditions, which are powered mainly by fantasies of power. And they're simply not possible anymore. And that's the reason why there's been such a profound and sudden change in the US. Donald Trump did not create that change. Advisors around him, such as the realists in international relations, have produced extremely credible and compelling reasons for the United States to withdraw effectively from its international obligations. But really what they're doing is they're saying, we're not going to pay for the international system anymore because we no longer see it as useful. We're not going to sponsor the IMF or the World Economic Forum, because the United States did sponsor the World Economic Forum. And we're not going to pay for NATO, and we're not going to pay for the World Health Organization. We're not going to pay for any of these because they were really vehicles of projecting US imperial power globally. And we no longer pursue an imperium. We pursue a national interest that's based upon national renewal, reindustrialization, and national populism.
Mhm.
And what national populism is actually pursuing policies that are actually good for your people instead of bankrupting and plundering them and telling them that they're wicked criminals when they complain.
On that note, what has been interesting to see, and I've alluded to this before, and people that follow the Substack would know this as well. So having moved from the UK over to Mexico at the start of the year, obviously, news in the UK centers a lot around what's going on in the UK and the EU and touches upon other parts of the world. Whereas being over here, of course, a lot of the news, correlates between, obviously what's going on in Mexico, but certainly what's going on north of the border. Trump bad, orange man, etc., etc., etc. You get all of that sort of stuff. I
He's
guess my
literally
point,
Hitler.
yeah, of course he is. And it's what I find fascinating is that it seems to me that people from the United States, and I obviously don't speak for everyone, there's going to be exceptions. It seems that they are very unhappy with, for example, Doge and Elon Musk. And that's probably why you see all these, Teslas and Tesla factories being torched just because they don't like evil Hitler Musk. As I've seen some of the stuff that's been going up in London on like bus stops and all the propaganda going on there, crazy. My point being, it seems that people are not happy with Doge, for example, because they're actually uncovering a lot of shady stuff that's been going on, and they don't like that. A lot of stuff is rotten to the core, and I think that yes, you can go down a rabbit hole, and the more you know, the more dangerous it is. But when you've got billions being spent on, I don't know, supporting, I don't know, transgender basketball in Malawi, whatever, I'm making that up, and people are getting annoyed that that's being found out. It's like that just never ceases to amaze me. My point being, I've become more aware of that, given where I am now in the world. It just the mind boggles. It really does.
In 1948, 1 year after the creation of the CIA, George Kennan published a paper called On the Inauguration of Organized Political Warfare. In it, he called for the use of all forms of Western cultural production to be mobilized in a form of global propaganda for the liberal system. And this was done. Francis Stoner Saunders wrote a book called Who Pays the Piper that documented how many thought leaders like Clement Greenberg or Isaiah Berlin or philharmonic orchestras or modern artists like Mark Rothko and Jackson Pollock were directly sponsored by the CIA to propagandize the liberal system at home and abroad. Television producers, people like David Geffen, who are on the Council of Foreign Relations, who runs one of the biggest music and Hollywood companies in the world. These people are interested in manufacturing belief through the production of mass cultural artifacts, such as news
Mhm.
and entertainment and all manner of things. Your so-called public intellectuals, the people who are put before you as serious thinkers like Douglas Murray and Matt Goodwin and so on, they are sponsored by the management to lead you into belief systems that do not conflict with the aims of the liberal global empire. Now, when you do this, what you're basically doing is you're sponsoring culture in all of your host nations and those nations that you've targeted for absorption next. So you are rigging the culture. Your culture has become a series of advertisements for the people who rule you. That costs an enormous amount of money. Now, overnight, if you abandon the idea of creating and securing a global empire through this method, it becomes corruption. And that's all that's happened. The most stunning thing is how much money's been put into things like the foundation that owns the newswire Reuters or Politico or the sponsorship of the BBC fact-checking service. Now, on the surface, these things look quite disturbing, but there's much more underneath about stealth, about the sponsorship of espionage operations and so on to defame and identify and undermine critics of the liberal regime, how any kind of liberal critical policies attract the attention of people who will call you an extremist and try to ruin your life. Anything from speaking out about 15-minute cities to complaining about mask mandates
Mhm.
or being suspicious of vaccines or being opposed to the Ukraine war. why does Ukraine matter so much? Well, the reason why it matters so much is because Europe doesn't have any industry anymore. It doesn't have any army, and it needs influence. And it sought to topple the Russian government by bleeding it on the battlefield and isolating it with sanctions, which have actually sabotaged the European industrial base and deprived it of cheap energy. It's been utterly self-defeating.
Hmm.
So that war's been lost. But the whole point of it wasn't about Ukraine. It was about Russia. It's about regime change in Russia, because if Britain and Europe could get that, then they'd have
Hmm.
enormous geopolitical pull, and they'd have effective control over Russia's near limitless mineral resources, including its oil and gas and so on. And this was the reason that was undertaken, and it's failed. So that was a very serious gambit. So these governments have all invested their political capital completely in Project Ukraine. This means that when this unravels, they will be tied to the enormous corruption that has actually been funding. And I believe of all the regime change wars, I've written extensively over the last couple of years on regime change. I think this is probably the worst of all of them for the kind of criminal corruption that our money and the Americans' money and the Europeans' money has been spent on. When you find out what's been going on there, you'll be appalled, even if you know very well what that, for example, Northern Alliance allied tribes people in Afghanistan were supplied with Viagra so they could more efficiently rape boys, or that a United States Marines colonel was dismissed for attempting to prevent them from doing so when he and his unit were charged with protecting a Northern Alliance warlord who had a harem of boys on a United States Army base. He was outraged about this and tried to intervene, and he was discharged dishonorably. These are published cases. These kind of things happen. That's what US taxpayers' money also paid for in these regime change operations, not just sending women to school in Waziristan, ridiculous ideas like this, teaching them how great it is to abandon their traditional culture, take antidepressants and hormone disruptors to abortifacients and so on, the contraceptive pill, and then, basically defeminize themselves for progress. It wasn't just that. We also supplied boy rapists with drugs to enjoy themselves with their children harems that we protected on our military bases. So that was shocking. But if that's not shocking enough for you, wait till you see what comes out of Ukraine. I'm not going to talk about it because people have been murdered doing so. So it will come out. And then people in the British government, the French government, the German government, whichever party prevails there, whichever of the liberals is in charge, they'll all be held to this, and it will ruin them. I believe that this scandal will be used by the Trump administration to finish off the remnants of the liberal empire in Europe and Britain.
Obviously, we're touching on Ukraine there. If we can, let's just take a 30,000 foot view of it. And yeah, let's don't want anyone to be talking and getting murdered as a result. So that's not the aim of this podcast and this conversation. What what I see personally is, again, going what if you look at sanctions and how they've backfired. I mean, all it's done is put Russia closer to China. Now, you could argue that's a massive fault of the previous president of the United States and policy setting there. Yes, the sanctions have backfired remarkably on the UK and Europe. All you got to do is look at your energy bills. I had a couple of friends send me recent energy bills. You got things like Thames Water being bailed out, but that's a different story. My point being that because there's a sovereign crisis, and I think we touched upon this first time round, because there's a sovereign crisis going on in Europe, because there's also a lot of financial irregularities and issues. For me, it seems to mean that regardless of what happens between Trump and Putin, maybe they do agree a ceasefire, maybe they do, warm relations between those countries. I think the EU uh, and the UK could just turn around, stick two fingers up, and go, "No, that's not good enough. We have to have a hot war," and that's to guide away from all the sovereign issues at the moment. I mean, that's my two pence on it. I don't know if that's something you agree with or not there, Frank.
Well, I've donned this costume to try and indicate my opinion of the outcome. I think it's an absolutely preposterous idea, right? First of all, the Trump-Putin negotiations probably been concluded months ago, in my view. They know what each of them want. It's not anything restricted to Ukraine. It's not just about Ukraine. This is about if you want to call it a reset, but a complete realignment of US-Russia relations. That's
Mhm.
what you're looking at. That means the United States is not going to go to war with Russia, it's going to trade with it. The United States' government is currently under negotiations to buy the Nord Stream pipelines, for example, and to restart gas supplies into Europe, regardless of the wishes of the Liberals in Germany. So these things are taking place without these lunatics. The lunatics I'm talking about are the Liberals who are pro-war, because
Mhm.
once peace breaks out, they'll be destroyed. Their reputations will be destroyed
Mhm.
by the
Yeah.
revelation of what they've been supporting in that war. That
Mhm.
is an obvious fact if you look at the evidence closely enough. So the Americans aren't just seeking a ceasefire. The Russians and the Americans are working out a long-term geostrategic deal, which will see their respective power blocks, and they are power blocks, negotiate with each other and trade with one another.
Mhm.
Why are they doing this? Well, I think it was Metternich who came up with this. There's been a long tradition in European diplomacy that there is no peace in Europe if there isn't peace between Russia and Germany, because there can't be. And so stabilizing that is key to international security. And this is what you've heard a lot of talk about security guarantees. Well, it's just nonsense. Of course, you can't guarantee people's security if you go around threatening to expand your empire up to their borders. It's ridiculous. There's
Mhm.
no military solution here either. The security guarantee is ridiculous. The way you guarantee security in practice is you make it in people's interest to avoid war. That's to say, you listen to their concerns, you stop provoking conflicts with them. You take seriously their security concerns, and you make trade deals with them so you are in an arrangement of mutual benefit. This is a realistic way to conduct transactions with people, not by threatening. As for that, I forget the fellow's name. He had a very interesting German. But there's a German academic who is regarded as the foremost historian of the German army. And late in 2023, he addressed a Berlin conference of military chiefs, European
Mhm.
ones, NATO ones. His standout remark was that Europe's armies would be washed away within weeks in a war with Russia. He also said that the entire ammunition stocks would be depleted within 2 weeks. He then said that if the money was found to rearm and restore the German military, it would take 15 years to do so. Now, this man knows what he's talking about, and he's listened to by all the German generals, and he's right. Last week, a Commodore from the Royal Navy, retired Commodore, published a paper in Responsible Statecraft, which was very well researched, and said that NATO would now lose a war with Russia. It doesn't have the capacity to win.
Mhm.
This might be shocking to people who've been, if you forgive me for saying so, raised on a load of bollocks all their lives, because that's what it is. You've been listening to a load of bollocks, and you believe that bollocks is actually more convincing than reality. But in reality, it is a load of bollocks that we could have a war and survive it even. We wouldn't survive it. We'd be crushed. If you go to NATO briefings, may God have mercy on your soul, or you look at what the Royal Institute says, the Royal United Services Institute says, ever since the end of the Second World War, all the briefings have concluded that the Russians would basically roll over you.
Mhm.
But they couldn't be stopped, absent, and this was even when we had the British Army, the Rhine, and hundreds of thousands of troops in Germany, so on. They would still lose because the Red Army was bigger and Russia's a land power, and for other reasons as well, due to the fact that they can absorb enormous casualties and have done throughout their history and everything like that. You could only stop them by dropping strategic nuclear weapons on them, which is obviously big no-no. So there's no
Mhm.
realistic way, and there never has been, of winning a land war without total mobilization, and even then, it's going to be very bloody indeed. The question being, why would you want to have one? Why has the British government tried to provoke one? Why have the French tried to provoke one? And so on. Well, that's because their entire political careers, their future of their political system even, relies on preventing the outbreak of peace. The liberal democratic system has always been a war system.
Mhm.
It was actually designed by people whose main achievement was persuading the United States population, Americans, to enter the First World War. It has been persuading people to enter wars ever since. And the way they did it in that war was to get Woodrow Wilson to say, we need to fight this war to make the world safe for democracy. Now, how many times have you heard that?
Mhm.
How many Hitlers have we fought in the last, 30 years to make the world safe for democracy? We had Hitler Hussein, didn't we? Like, Saddam Hitler. You've got to try and make it work. We've been warned about domestic Hitlers. At one point, Bordolf Hitlerson, Boris Johnson, was Hitlerized. for his prorogation of Parliament. Matteo Hitlini in Italy, Marine Le Hitler, Marine Le Hitler. Yeah.
That's a good one.
Of course, the AfD, because nobody cares to learn, Alice Weidel's name. So the AfD are just a kind of bunch of collective Hitlers. They've been collectively Hitlerized for their Hitleresque policies of wanting to have a nation being able to afford your heating, maybe having borders, and stopping wars. I mean, it's a dangerous game to paint all the baddies as Churchill and all the goodies as Hitler, is it not? I
Hmm.
mean, last week, The Economist published a ridiculous cartoon. I thought it must have been a joke or a meme at first of Keir Starmer being Churchillized. And they called him Churchill Starmer or Keir Churchill or something.
Wow.
Preposterous. But
Wow.
I mean, again, this is a dangerous game. You earlier on talked about the abolition of the 20th century. Well,
Mm.
one of the enduring myths of the 20th century is that Britain had a kind of victory in the Second World War. Well, we didn't have to enter that. That was due to the Lippmann gap, if you like, to the overcommitment to foreign security guarantees, about Poland, which incidentally got wrecked anyway. Nobody really likes to remember that. But what happened to us? Well, what happened to this great victory? Our army was disarmed and fled from northern France, losing all of its equipment. We gave all of our gold to the United States, which
Mhm.
is now, if there is anything left in Fort Knox, most of it will carry the imprimatur of the Bank of England. We gave all our financial securities to the United States. We agreed to an exorbitant rate of interest for debts that we only paid off in 2008, whilst the Soviet Union Lend-Lease paid cents on the dollar, by the way, and never paid off their debts. Not many people know that, but the Russians weren't held to their debts. And more tanks were actually sunk in the sea trying to deliver them to the Russians than actually arrived or were destroyed in the entire war. There's an enormous amount of money was spent arming the Soviet Union, and they never paid for it. But we were milked dry till the pips squeaked. And at the end of the war, our empire had been given away. When you
Mm.
lose your empire and you're bankrupted and debt enslaved, you don't usually call that winning, do you? But we do. And the man who did that to us, we call him a hero. And that's because under liberalism, winning is for losers. If you win, you lose. If you lose, you win. And
Mhm.
so that's why we are being told that we should enter a war with the Russians who look, none of this is real. We're not really, Keir Starmer's not really going to send troops in. None of this is going to happen. There's not going to be a war with the Russians because we don't have any armies. We don't have the money. We don't have the industry to manufacture the weapons.
Mhm.
We've given a lot of our useful weapons to be used in losing the war in Ukraine. So the material isn't there. The army, British army, is shrinking. It's demoralised. There's trannies in it, for goodness sake. I mean, I know this for a fact because I volunteered as a reservist in it. And I left because it is flamboyantly gay. And I am not a queer, so I will not fight under the rainbow banner. And that is basically it. It's now practically illegal to be a man in the army, which is why I used to wear this, my combat wig, because it's also illegal to disagree with a man wearing a black woman's wig. If you wear a woman's wig, obviously it's great, but if it's a black woman's wig like this one, then you're bulletproof, maybe invincible. And so I would wear it, and I would refuse to take it off because obviously you're not allowed to say that, And for all they know, I may just have spontaneously transitioned, which of course I have. If I say that I have. So, since our entire reality and our civilization has transitioned, there's simply nothing's ridiculous anymore. Because if you laugh at men in wigs, you can probably be imprisoned. For centuries, a man in a dress on stage was a staple of British theatre, wasn't it? Pantomime comedy. But now, if you laugh at Widow Twank, you're facing a prison sentence.
I will. I'll
This is
save
one of
that
the
for.
reasons why look, jokes aren't funny anymore.
Of
What
course.
that's another thing about having a liberal monoculture. Jokes aren't funny anymore. They're like some endless PowerPoint lecture delivered by a humorless commissar. At the end you're just supposed to seal clap when someone says Nigel Farage, as if he's actually an alternative to this liberal nightmare and not just a fag smoking Thatcherite who's going to sell you down the river. And look, by the way, about Margaret Thatcher as well, I don't worship Margaret Thatcher or Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was the first man to normalize millions of illegal immigrants in the United States and supported gay marriage in 1978. Margaret Thatcher said at the end of her tenure that Tony Blair was my greatest achievement. Margaret Thatcher was the person who saw the deindustrialization of our country that destroyed the working class communities that I come from. The reason why a scumbag like me exists is largely due to that. So there's no dignity in labor anymore.
Hmm.
People don't make anything anymore. Work isn't fun anymore. You can't have a laugh anymore. And I know people in the army who have been bollocked by basically chisel-faced lesbians for laughing at memes, incidentally, which I sent. And I think the meme, the meme in question, right? So one bloke that I know went to CIC in Catterick, which is the combat infantryman's course, where
Mhm.
you're supposed to go and learn how to kill people in the infantry, right? It's supposed to be fun, they try and make it as joyless as possible. And I sent them this meme where you've probably seen it. It's just a 4-panel meme, and it says, "Gentlemen, today we fight under our new banner." And then, the leader on horseback pulls up this gay flag. They turn to each other and say, "I hope we lose." Well, which is basically the truth. So I sent them this, and then some irate lesbians became aware of it because, of course, that's what the NCOs are nowadays. And they made them take their shoes off and sit on the floor and have a 3-hour lecture on why jokes aren't funny. So that's what you get. Like, you volunteered to kill His Majesty's enemies. You find yourself being harangued by humorless harpies for laughing at pictures on your phone, which are funny. So you're not allowed to have a laugh now. I mean, the bloke who is in charge of Colonel, I forget his name, who's basically in charge of the warfighting army a couple of years ago, said that we have to get rid of toxic masculinity in the infantry, even though it makes us more effective. Now, if you think all this is like just ridiculous, and it is ridiculous, but it's true. I think it's
Mhm.
not true. I hate doing this, but I did actually write a report about this, a two-parter saying the vanishing British Army. It's about the numbers going down. But the second one is about the transitioning of the British Army. And it centers upon the case of WO1 Deborah Penny, who isn't really called Deborah, is probably called Colin. He's an enormous bloke. He looks like a shaven mountain gorilla in a dress. He's the most unfemale spectacle I've ever witnessed. And I've seen some monsters in the army. Obviously, it's full of kind of dangerous, illiterate thugs, or it used to be anyway. Until the only way you could survive as one was to put a skirt on and call yourself a woman. And W.O. Penny now says, "I transitioned the British Army through my transition." He's been immortalised with a likeness in the National Portrait Gallery and appeared famously last year next to 4 birds on Army Women's Day. And there's like 4 women all looking quite uncertain. And there's this huge man mounted in a skirt, basically Warrant Officer Gorlock. And so whenever anyone asks me about what I think about, oh, should we fight the Russians and all that, I said, yeah, send in the trannies.
Oh, I don't, sorry. Of course, I shouldn't laugh. It's a serious podcast and a serious conversation. I'm not allowed to laugh at jokes.
Nothing more serious than a man in a wig.
I will point out for podcast reference that Frank a couple of times has put on a wig in order to demonstrate our seriousness in this conversation. So if you're wondering what all that extra
Wignity.
laughing about,
It's
Frank, I
wignity.
don't. um, I guess the the question, but I would say be good to wrap up. But the open-ended question I'm just about to ask you could sail this conversation on for a little bit longer. Uh, the question is, where do we go from here?
Oh, right. Yeah. People call me an optimist, and it makes me mightily displeased to hear that because I'm not an optimist and I despise false hope. I would never tell people pleasing lies just to console them. I think the best thing you can do with your life is seek the grace of God and try to live without consolations. And what that means is don't listen to stories because you like them. Obviously, don't listen to me because I'm not a very likable person. But aside from that, where do we go from here? If you look at reality, you can see that there is no way out for the liberal system, that it has failed. It's lost its main sponsor. Its methods of power, chiefly
Mhm.
through the sponsorship of culture and propaganda, are being revealed as corruption. And they are seen as such. And you can simply see the fact now that liberal democracies are just ruled by loyal, corrupt officials whichever uniform they wear, whether they're in the modern Vatican synodal church, whether they wear the uniforms of church and state, whether they're police, or judges or politicians, whichever walk of life they're in, they're just corrupt officials. And it's obvious that they're corrupt because all their policies amount to national suicide. And that realization is slowly dawning on people. And once they realize that, and they will, and they are, there's no coming back. There's no amount of advertising or bribery or lies. There's no amount of name calling that's going to corral people back onto the plantation. And we have been living on a plantation. That's to say, we've been living on a tightly policed kind of cognitive concentration camp where any attempt to get over the fence is met with force or threats. And some of these threats are serious. So how long can you carry on penning people in and calling them names when they complain about the misery you've made of their lives? These aren't ultimately questions of political loyalty. They're just practical, realistic questions like people can't afford to have families. Mm-hmm. The cities are in a state, the towns are a mess, that they're visibly degrading, that nothing's getting better, everything's getting worse. It's getting more dangerous and crime-ridden. The police, 5 major police forces in Britain last year have been severally litigated for their refusal to investigate crimes. What kind of country? There's no future for that system. It's all it can do is what it's doing now, is illegalize the opposition and penalize anyone who complains about liberal systems. You can't vote for popular policies. They're called nasty names. The reason why it's called populism is because it's popular, which means by inference, the alternative isn't. Now, that unpopularity isn't due to online extremism. It's not due to propaganda and lies. It's because of reality. It's because of the reality we are forced to live in as a result of these mad policies. And they are mad policies. And they're dishonest because their goal genuinely is to dismantle individual nations and to level them down into a global monoculture. Now, that model has vanished. So where do these systems have to go? When you said that the Europeans and the Britain could realistically stick 2 fingers up to the United States and say we're going to go the own way, that's not possible. There isn't any industry left. There isn't any, without agreements with Russia, there isn't a reliable energy supply left. Mm-hmm. There isn't the military power left. And in fact, there's no unity in Europe to do this. As Dr. Samantha Mitra likes to point out, he's the man who came up with Trump withdrawal from NATO, the dormant NATO policy. When I spoke to him about it, he said there are in fact several Europes. If you look at it dispassionately, there's what you might call conservative Eastern Europe, things like Hungary, the Polish population, the Slovakians, and so on. These people don't want to become liberals. They don't want to open their society, as George Soros says. They don't want to be homosexualized. They prefer to have a traditional family culture and a cohesive national identity. They want borders. Surely it is their democratic right to insist on living how they wish to live. Now, the reason why there's tension there is because it isn't, because the European Union is attempting to enforce this uniformity of culture across itself, because it is a liberal organization, and therefore it seeks to export these policies wherever it rules and beyond its borders, and constantly expand its influence, because, in case you haven't noticed, it's expansionist as well. Mm-hmm. And it does that by trying to unify cultures, which means the annihilation of your history, traditions, religion, beliefs, identity, and ultimately your people, as we all become uniform. Now, if you reject that, you're called a bad person. Now, this brings us to one obvious point. Who are the real extremists? The project to replace Western civilization with this counterfeit model towards a utopia that could never realistically have been realized, I'd say is probably the most extreme political project ever undertaken, and likely is going to remain so for a very long time, because the rest of the world's powers are realist. The United States is realist, China is realist, Russia is realist. These are the major powers of the world, and they're largely cohesive for reasons which are not liberal. That's because they don't pursue utopian programs. They don't try and assert the reality of fantasy over facts, because it's politically expedient to do so. So there is no future, economically, militarily, diplomatically, for a Europe that is divided culturally and economically between the formerly rich and the less rich nations, shall we say, because Germany's effectively run out of money. So how can you continue the European Union when it was organized in such a way to be financed by a burgeoning German economy, which would effectively subsidize the satellite poorer nations,
Mhm.
such as Portugal and Ireland and Italy and Greece and Spain? We can't do that anymore. So if it's bankrupt, what can it do now? It can abolish its own fiscal responsibility and try to borrow €1 trillion. Now, this is probably not a prudent move. The Europeans have tried to seize the frozen Russian assets, but this would be an act of theft, which would collapse any confidence in European markets and completely delegitimize them. They would get the money. They probably wouldn't get a war. They'd probably get away with it, but at enormous cost, at a cost that would ruin them. So the remedy will ruin them. All the remedies ruin them. There's no way out. You will not see these governments. These are the last liberal governments of our lifetimes. They won't be there in 5 to 10 years' time. The world's changed. They don't make sense anymore.
Mhm.
They belong to a system that has vanished. If you like, they are like a die-hard person waving the Soviet flag after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Or if you want, people like Ursula von der Leyen and Keir Starmer are like the kind of Japanese soldier that fights on in the Philippines, only they're not waving the flag of the Empire of the Rising Sun, but that of the rainbow flag, because of course you can't be taken seriously unless you agree with putting things into your anus.
I think that's a very I think it's a very good way to end. I think there's a lot there's so many other directions that we could go. But it would be, I think, prudent again, maybe in 6 to 8 months or so, checking it again. Because I always think that it's useful to see what's going on.
Well,
I
if they
don't
have
really.
cameras in jail, yes, I'll happily speak to you.
Yeah, I think my profile on X says that I'm somewhere in the gulags. So we've not been imprisoned. We've not been imprisoned yet. So I'm very happy to say that we're
I think
we're
they'd
alive and
like to,
kicking.
but they're probably just too incompetent to get round to it, to be honest. I don't have the confidence in my own state nowadays to even run an effective show trial.
No, I think that's a damning indictment of everything at the moment.
No, it's lol.
To be
It's
fair.
lol, really. One thing I want to say before I go is that you must not believe in the existence of some omnipotent secret organization directing affairs. These people really are as useless as they look. This is the end for them. They're desperate. I would suggest that next time, if you're interested in seeing what Keir Starmer's doing, just turn the sound down and look at his face. And he looks like a man in a hostage video who knows he's not getting out.
I would agree with that. I
So,
do agree with that from what I've seen.
this is panic. There's panic. Panic in Europe, panic in Brussels, panic in London, panic in Paris. How long can they keep out the politics of sanity and reality? Because that's what they're arguing against. It's not. No one's seeing the rise of an authoritarian empire. These are simply people who want to live a better life without war, without an undeclared war on their entire civilization
Mhm.
that is destroying everything of value in life, including the value of life. You can't afford to have children anymore, which means your nation is dying out. The elderly are being encouraged to kill themselves as a form of civic duty. What kind of life is this? There's simply no meaning left to life anymore.
Mhm.
Work has no dignity. What's the point of going to work if you can't afford anywhere to live and you can't afford to have any
Mhm.
children, you can't buy a house, and the only thing that you're going to leave behind is an inbox full of unanswered emails as a testament to your life's efforts? There's nothing worth living for. This isn't an argument that you can make on the nightly news.
Mhm.
It's over.
I would like to think that when we next speak that all hell hasn't broken loose, but let's see what happens. Frank, I always like to give people the opportunity to say how they can be found, etc., i.e. Your Substack. Is that the best place to find you and read your works?
It is. It is. I would strongly advise you to spend as little time on the internet as you possibly can. But if you want to read my goings on, Frank Wright at Substack, you can find me there. I publish a chapter of my forthcoming book, A Brief History of Liberal Democracy, every Monday, which is intended for the general reader to explain the actual workings of the liberal system that's dissolving now. It's paid, half of it's always free. If you haven't got any money, email me and tell me that you're skint, and I'll let you in for nothing. But if you do have money, that money rightfully belongs in my wife's current account because I am a shameless grifter. But I'm not like the other grifters, you see. I'm better than them. And you'd only spend it on rubbish anyway, let's face it. So, there you are. You can find me there if you want to. And whilst I still exist on the Twitters, by the grace of God, you can find me there too. But surely it's a matter of time before I'm dragged off to the gulags with this fellow here as well. Make sure you wear your leather boots, though, because otherwise we'll run out soon.
Yes, no, very good point, well made. Yeah, always wear your leather boots to the gulag. Frank, as usual, I'll put all those links into the show notes that come with the podcast as well. Thank you very much again for your time. I learned a lot there. I think there's a lot of yeah, a lot of pain. I think that's going to come, and we'll catch up later on in the year, and we'll see what the lay of the land is then.
Don't go mad in the interim. There are better times ahead. The evil empire is dissolved. Don't go insane with it.